The crowd gathered in the dimly lit alley as whispers spread about a challenge no one had dared to accept, and the air was heavy with the scent of rain, soaked concrete and distant street food as neon signs flickered weakly against the shadows, cast by the tall brick walls that seemed to lean closer with every breath. People huddled together, some curious, some skeptical, and others just eager for something to break the monotony of the night. A group of teenagers pushed through the mass of BAFTAs trying to get to the front, their faces lit with excitement, while older men stood back, their arms folded and eyes narrowed like they had seen enough fights to know how these things usually ended. A low hum of conversation rippled through the crowd, snippets of talk about rumors that had been spreading for days, about a test of strength and skill unlike anything the city had seen before. Some claimed it was just for show, a staged event to impress tourists and locals. Alike others swore it was real, that the fighters were genuine, and that the risks were as high as the stakes were invisible. The alley itself seemed alive with anticipation, the walls vibrating faintly with the bass from a nearby nightclub and the smell of fried food mixing with the faint metallic tang of the rainwater trickling down the gutter. A stray cat slinked between legs, its tail flicking in irritation as people jostled for a better view. At the far end of the alley, a single dim light flickered above a steel door, its glow barely cutting through the gloom and casting long shadows that danced with every shift in the crowd. Somewhere a bottle clinked against the pavement and a man coughed roughly, his voice raspy from years of smoke. The crowd pressed closer as a figure emerged from the shadows. She moved with deliberate calm, her steps measured, her head slightly lowered as if listening for something only she could hear. She was tall but not imposing, slender yet strong every step, making it clear she had no fear of what was coming. The murmur of voices grew louder as she entered the open space. At the center of the alley, some people recognized her immediately, their eyes widening in disbelief. Others whispered questions to their neighbors, trying to find out who she was and why she had agreed to this challenge. She stood there for a moment, letting the noise wash over her, her gaze sweeping across the crowd with quiet confidence. Her hands loose at her sides, her breathing steady. A small group near the front tried to get her attention, calling out to her, but she did not respond. Her focus was elsewhere, waiting for the moment to begin. The energy of the crowd shifted, then a mix of awe and curiosity tinged with the electric buzz of anticipation. The challenge was about to start, and the air felt like it was holding its breath. A tall figure stepped forward, her eyes calm yet sharp, scanning the faces around her like a predator, choosing its moment. The light from the flickering lamp above caught in her hair, making it gleam for a split second before she moved again, her boots making almost no sound on the wet ground. She paused briefly, letting her gaze drift over the faces in the crowd, as if memorizing each one and weighing them against something only she understood. The tension in the alley thickened like a rope, pulled tighter with every heartbeat. The sound of distant sirens wailed faintly, then faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the city and the soft shuffle of restless feet. A man near the front cleared his throat and called out something mocking and low, but she did not even blink. Her attention locked instead on the far end of the alley, where three men stood together, each one different in build but united in the same expression of challenge, their eyes fixed on her as if she were prey they meant to take down one by one. The first was broad-shouldered, his hands clenched into fists that cracked as he flexed them, his face set in a grin that did not reach his eyes. The second was lean, wiry, and constantly shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze darting like a snake waiting for the perfect strike. The third stood still as stone, tall and quiet, his presence alone sending a ripple of unease through those who watched. The crowd murmured louder now as the realization sank in that this was no friendly spar. This was a test of raw ability without the comfort of weapons, without the safety of rules. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, the drops splashing into puddles around their feet and glistening on the walls behind them. She tilted her head slightly as if listening to the rhythm of the water, her expression unreadable. A man in the back whispered that she had once been a soldier, another claimed she had been in underground fight circuits for years, but no one knew for certain. She took one step forward, closing the space between herself and the first man, her eyes locked on his like a steel trap. The crowd fell almost silent, as if they sensed that the first move would be the spark to light the entire scene into chaos. The man smirked and rolled his shoulders, his boots squeaking slightly against the wet ground. She waited, not moving a muscle, and in that stillness there was a power that made even the second and third men glance at each other, as if they too felt something they had not expected. The lamp above them buzzed faintly, flickering once before steadying, and in That brief dim light, her shadow stretched long across the slick ground, making her seem larger than life. And perhaps for that moment she was. Someone shouted the question, could people really battle without weapons and still win? The words carried over the crowd, cutting through the sound of rain and the restless shifting of bodies. It was the challenge spoken aloud, and it seemed to pull the air tighter around everyone. She did not answer, at least not with words. Instead, she simply shifted her stance, her right foot sliding slightly back, her shoulders loosening, her hands open and relaxed, as if inviting the first move. The broad-shouldered man grinned again and stepped forward, his boots making a dull splash in the puddle between them, his movements confident, almost casual, like someone who had ended fights quickly and often. The crowd leaned in, every eye locked on them. The man feinted, with a quick jab to her left side, testing her reaction, but she did not bite. She moved her head, just enough to avoid the line of attack, and then reset as if the strike had never happened. The second man laughed quietly from where he stood, clearly amused, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching for weaknesses. The first man tried again. This time faster, a straight punch aimed at her chest, the kind that could knock the wind out of someone if it landed, but her body twisted to the side in a smooth arc, and her hand came up, brushing his arm away with a motion so fluid it seemed like water turning aside a stone before it could hit the shore. The crowd murmured, a few voices gasping at the ease with which she had handled it. The man scowled now, no longer treating her as an easy mark. His steps quickened, his shoulders rolling forward as he launched a flurry of strikes, each one more aggressive than the last. But her defense was a dance, every movement timed perfectly, every step measured. The sound of their feet echoed in the narrow alley, mixing with the hiss of rain against the pavement. Then came the opening, a fraction of a second, when his weight shifted too far forward, his balance just slightly off. She stepped inside his guard, her arms snapping up to catch his neck in a controlled but unyielding grip, before pivoting her hips and sending him tumbling over her shoulder, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The crowd roared, the sudden burst of noise almost deafening. But she had already stepped back, her breathing still calm, her eyes turning to the next man, the wiry one whose restless movements had not stopped even for a moment. He grinned at her, in a way that suggested he welcomed the challenge, his arms loose and ready as he began to circle her like a predator testing for a weak spot. Rain dripped steadily down his face, but he did not seem to notice. The second round was about to begin, and the tension in the air felt sharp enough to cut. She gave a faint smile and stepped into the center, her stance steady as the second opponent began to close the distance. His eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to burn through the rain. He moved light on his feet, almost bouncing with each step, his body swaying side to side in a way that made it hard to tell which direction he would attack from. The crowd had fallen into a hush, now their voices replaced by the rhythmic patter of rain on metal and concrete. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn blared and faded away, leaving the alley, as the entire world, for those watching his first strike, came fast, a snapping kick toward her ribs, but she pivoted, letting it pass close enough to feel the rush of air it carried. He followed with a sweeping punch aimed at her head, his speed impressive, but not enough. She ducked low and moved in under his guard, her shoulder pressing into his chest, forcing him to step back. To regain balance, his grin widened as if enjoying the pushback. His feet shifted in quick patterns, his arms flicking out in feints that were designed to draw her into a trap, but she remained patient, never overcommitting. Her hands stayed relaxed, her eyes locked on his center mass, watching for the telltale shift that would give away his true intent. The tension mounted, each second feeling longer than the last, until he lunged forward with a combination of strikes. A left to distract her, a right meant to land hard, and then a sudden low kick to sweep her legs, but her body moved with seamless precision, stepping into his space so the kick lost its force. Her right hand catching his wrist and twisting sharply, his balance faltered, and before he could recover she spun around behind him, her leg hooking his from the side as her forearm pressed across his upper back. He was on the ground in the next breath, his face inches from the wet pavement. The sound of his fall echoing off the alley walls, gasps and murmurs rippled through the onlookers, but she did not even glance at them. Her focus was already shifting to the third man, the tall, silent figure, who had not moved from his position at the far end of the alley. His stillness made him all the more imposing. The rain clung to him like a second skin, running in rivulets down the lines of his face, his eyes unblinking as he watched her with an unreadable expression. He took one slow step forward, then another, the sound of his boots heavy against the slick ground, each movement deliberate, measured. The crowd seemed to lean back instinctively, as if the air itself had thickened around him, and the space between them was charged with something dangerous, something final. With a swift turn and a blur of movement, she sent him crashing to the ground, the air thick with disbelief. Yet there was no pause, no time for the moment to settle, because the third man had closed the distance between them. His height casting a long shadow across the wet pavement, his presence alone, heavier than the noise of the crowd. He did not rush, instead he stopped a few feet away. His eyes locked onto hers as if trying to read the depth of her resolve. The rain pattered against his shoulders, glistening in the dim light, while the crowd shifted uneasily, some whispering about his reputation, others swearing they had seen him fight before and that no one had walked away. Unscathed, she breathed slowly, her shoulders loose, her hands opened the space between them, a silent challenge, neither willing to make the first move. The tension stretched until it felt like the air might snap. Then, without warning, he stepped in with a strike aimed at her head, the speed surprising for someone his size. She bent at the waist, letting the blow pass just above her, the force of it stirring the air enough to brush her hair across her cheek. He followed with a sharp elbow meant to crush her guard, but she slid sideways, her feet splashing in a shallow puddle as she angled away. His head turned with her movement, his eyes never leaving her, his arms moving again with precise, controlled power. He was not like the others. He wasted no energy. Every strike was measured to end the fight quickly. She tested his reach, feinting left and shifting right, but his guard adjusted instantly, forcing her to retreat. A half step, the crowd reacted with a low murmur, sensing the danger in every exchange. He advanced again, a short hook to her ribs followed by a quick knee strike that would have winded a lesser fighter. She blocked the hook with her forearm, the shock running up to her shoulder, then twisted away from the knee. Just in time, her breathing steady, even as her mind raced to find the smallest flaw in his rhythm. The rain fell harder now, the ground slick underfoot as they circled each other, droplets sliding into their eyes, but neither blinking away the distraction. His next attack came in the form of a sudden lunge, his right hand shooting out to grab her by the collar, but she dropped her weight, spinning under his arm and driving her palm into his chest, the impact sending a shudder through his frame. He staggered half a step before resetting his stance, a faint smile flickering across his lips as if to acknowledge her skill, and then they moved again. Two shadows in constant motion, lit only by the sputtering lamp above. The second man hesitated only for a heartbeat before charging in, and she met him with a fluid strike that dropped him instantly, the thud of his fall still echoing. When the tall man shifted his weight and launched forward, his long stride covering the gap between them faster than the crowd expected, his right hand cut through the rain, aimed straight for her jaw. She leaned back, the strike missing by less than an inch, the wind of it brushing her cheek before her foot slid back to find solid ground. He followed with a low sweeping kick, his height giving the movement extra reach. She jumped over it, twisting her body midair to face him again, her landing soft despite the slick pavement. The onlookers gasped at the speed of the exchange, their eyes darting back and forth, trying to follow every motion. The man pressed forward, his fists a blur, his body moving with the precision of someone who had spent years honing every strike. She blocked high then low, her arms moving almost faster than sight, each deflection costing her energy, but she refused to give ground. Their feet splashed through shallow puddles, sending arcs of water into the air like silver ribbons under the dim light. The rain was heavier now, dripping into their hair, soaking their clothes and making every movement riskier, yet neither slowed. He stepped in with a brutal hook. She sidestepped just enough to avoid the blow, then countered with a sharp elbow to his ribs. The impact drew a grunt from him, his first sound since the fight began, but he did not falter. Instead, he caught her next punch in his palm, twisting her wrist as he tried to pull her forward into a knee strike. She pivoted with the motion, freeing her arm and shoving against his chest to create space. Her boots squealed against the wet ground as she spun away. His eyes followed her every move, reading her like a book, but she had begun to see the rhythm in his attacks. The smallest hitch in his shoulder before he committed to a strike, the faint narrowing of his eyes just before his weight shifted. She waited, letting him think he was pressing her into retreat. Then, when he lunged again, she stepped inside the arc of his punch, her hands locking on his forearm and collar. She dropped her center of gravity, pulling him forward and down. His balance broke in his body, tilting just enough for her to twist sharply, sending him sprawling into the puddled ground. The crowd erupted in a wave of noise, but she did not relax. She knew he would rise again, and he did slowly, his movements deliberate as he got to his feet, rainwater streaming from his hair, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths as he prepared to continue the fight. The third came in wild with fury, but she moved with the grace of water, twisting past his attacks and ending it in a single blow. Yet even as he rose from the slick ground, his steps were slower, more cautious now, his earlier stillness replaced with an edge of calculation. The rain poured harder, turning the alley floor into a mirror that reflected their movements in fractured silver light. The crowd pressed closer, but no one dared cross the invisible line of the fight. His shoulders rolled, once loosening the tension before he lunged again, his fists swinging in a flurry that was less measured than before, the sheer force behind each strike enough to crack bone if it connected. She wove through them, her body bending and twisting like a ribbon in the wind, her boots gripping the wet ground with just enough friction to keep her upright. Her breaths slow and controlled, her mind locked on the smallest window of opportunity. He stepped wide on his left foot, leaning forward to drive a punch toward her midsection, and she caught it not with her hands but with her entire movement, her body turning into the strike, her forearm deflecting his punch off course before her knee came up sharply, catching him in the side. The impact drove a hiss of pain from him, and he staggered back, his footing slipping for half a second, and that was all she needed. She closed the gap in 2 quick steps, her right hand snapping up to grip the back of his neck, her left hooking behind his knee. She wrenched them together in one fluid pull, his body folding awkwardly before he hit the ground with a splash, the sound of water erupting around them. The crowd roared, some cheering, others stunned into silence. She released him, immediately stepping back, her eyes fixed on him as he pushed himself up slowly, his breathing heavier than before, his face unreadable but his stance less certain. He charged. Again, desperation mixing with discipline, his attacks faster now, less predictable, his arms slicing through the air and forcing her to match his pace. She blocked high, ducked low, spun to avoid a sweeping kick, her muscles burning under the strain, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, and still she searched for the final opening. Then it came, a moment so brief it could have been missed by anyone else. His balance shifted forward too far, his guard dropped just slightly to the right. She moved in instantly, her palm driving into his chest with enough force to send him reeling backward into the wall. The impact echoed through the alley. He slid down to one knee, his head lowering, rainwater streaming off his jaw. The fight drained from his body. He stayed there for a moment, then slowly rose to his feet, and with the faintest nod stepped back, signaling the end. The silence that followed was heavier than the fight itself, every eye locked on her, as if seeing something unreal. The rain still fell, but no one moved, as if the sound of it striking the pavement was the only thing keeping the moment from shattering. She stood in the center of the alley, her chest rising and falling in slow measured breaths, her gaze sweeping across the crowd without urgency, her posture unchanged from the first moment she had stepped into the fight. The 3 men she had faced now stood apart, each one in a different stage of defeat. The first leaning against the wall holding his side, the second crouched low, his hands on his knees, his eyes still darting in disbelief, the third standing tall but silent, his head slightly bowed in acknowledgement. The people who had been pressed against the walls now began to step forward, their faces a mixture of awe and something deeper, a kind of reverence that only comes when witnessing something. Rare whispers moved through them, like a current telling and retelling what they had just seen, their voices growing louder with each passing second. Someone near the front said she had moved like lightning. Someone else said she had been as calm as a sleeping cat, until the moment she struck a young boy, clutched his father's coat, and asked if she was a hero. The man gave no answer, only watched her with the same fixed attention as the rest. A woman stepped forward, offering her a dry cloth, but she waved it away, the rain washing over her as if she belonged to it. Her eyes scanned the faces again, and for a moment it seemed she was searching for something or someone, but then the faintest smile touched her lips, and she began to walk toward the far end of the alley. The crowd parted without a word, their movements instinctive like waves. Retreating from the shore, they turned to watch her go, their voices rising in excitement now, each telling their version of the fight, claiming they had seen it from the best angle, or that they had caught the exact moment she had ended it. The first man she had thrown tried to speak, but his words were lost in the swell of conversation. The second sat back against the wall, running his hands over his face, as if trying to convince himself it had happened at all. The third remained standing, rainwater dripping from his jawline, his expression unreadable, but his eyes following her, until she disappeared into the shadow beyond the flickering light of the alley. Some swore she would return, others thought she had come only for this one night, this one moment. Whatever the truth, they knew one thing. The question had been answered, and the answer had not been given with words but with movement and skill so precise it had left them all holding their breath. She walked away without a word, leaving the question answered and the legend born in the minds of all who witnessed it. Her steps Slow, deliberate, the sound of her boots muffled by the rain, her silhouette shrinking against the narrow path ahead. The light from the alley fading behind her with each stride the night swallowed her form, until she became just another shadow in the maze of streets, yet the air still carried her presence. The crowd lingered long after she was gone, speaking in hushed voices, some replaying each moment of the fight, others speculating about who she was and where she had learned to move like that. A man in a dark coat leaned against the wall, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. He said he had seen fighters in every corner of the city, but never anyone like her. His words were met with nods and murmurs. A few tried to follow her path, stepping out into the rain, in the direction she had gone, but the street was empty, slick with water, reflecting only the dim glow of distant signs somewhere. A dog barked, and the sound echoed off the walls like a warning. The first opponent limped toward the exit, his pride clearly bruised more than his body. The second shook his head, muttering to himself, as if trying to rewrite the memory of his defeat. The third walked slowly, eyes lowered, his breathing steady, but the stiffness in his movements betraying the effort it had taken to endure her final strike. People began to disperse, drifting into side streets and narrow corridors, carrying the story with them like a secret too heavy to keep. One man said he would tell it at the docks, another swore he would speak of it in the markets by morning. The story would have grown new details, her eyes glowing in the dark, her strikes too fast to see, her strength enough to lift a man off his feet with one hand. By the next night it would no longer be a simple fight, but a myth told in bars and whispered among street corners, a tale about a woman who answered a question no one else dared to face, a single act that shifted how they thought about combat. Without weapons, somewhere far from the alley, she stopped under the cover of an old awning, her breathing finally slowing. She looked out at the rain falling in silver curtains, her reflection broken in the puddles at her feet. There was no audience here. No roar of approval, only the quiet hum of the city and the steady beat of her heart. She adjusted the collar of her jacket, turned down another street, and disappeared into the endless weave of the night. Her legend, already moving faster than she ever could, carried by voices that would not let the moment die.